an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 6, chapters 52 through 54, The Gathering Storm, The Terraced Kingdom, and The Blossom Festival. In these chapters, I don't know why I thought our crew was going to come face to face with Alustin by the end of this book. I should have known they were not going to, and yet I was still taken very aback by the ending of the book. I was like, but wait, hold on. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat early as usual. Appreciate you very much, Dan. And he's also handling some chatter because I found a home for my pup and I'm very excited about it. So we talked before I started recording. I won't get into it here and use up any more time, but suffice to say, very bittersweet. So these chapters, we start off in 52. We are still in Limnus. And what you guys remember probably when this book opened and Hugh was really struggling with his lungs, or maybe it was the book before. And I said something about how much I appreciated it, that this author did not hand wave injuries. I am gratified that even though Hugh's lung issues are so improved by the end of his stay here, they are not gone. And I just think about this a lot because, this is the sort of thing that I imagine has to be a real challenge to a lot of writers, that like the decision of how to handle an injury and whether you want it to have like a lasting repercussion or you want it to be something that can be played sort of for a shock in the moment, but that you then clear up and don't have to deal with later. And I won't say that the second one is an inherently cheap thing to do. I think that there are times where that actually works quite well. But the first, choosing to have it be an ongoing challenge, is difficult for the writer as much as the character. And I really think you guys, in the past few years, becoming more intersectional in my understanding of politics and social issues, really started with understanding the Black experience a little bit more and systemic racism. And recently it has spread out a lot more to understanding the stigma and difficulties surrounding disability. And I can't help sometimes but think that there's a sort of ableism in us just not wanting to see a character coping with an injury over and over again within a story, that we want them to be at full working capacity at all times because it's like more exciting. There are things that character maybe just can't do anymore and the author just wants to be able to write about, or the audience wants to be able to see. And while I understand that frustration, there are ways around doing that, or avenues that closing that off actually opens in other directions. And I think that it can be sort of a shame sometimes when we have such a lack of imagination as to what gaining a different experience means for a character. And I'm not trying to paint disability as like, oh, it's an experience and it's for the positive. It's a good challenge to like, no. Disability, it means different things to different people. And for some folks, it's like an extremely physical, like you can see that somebody is missing a limb, or you can tell that somebody's blind. And then there are people who deal with invisible disabilities, which are unfortunately something that our society just does not understand or cope with well. And so to some people, they can find a sort of empowerment in doing what they set their mind to, despite having this disability, and feel like, I am overcoming. And then there are people for whom that is not an option. You can't just decide not to be constantly exhausted or in pain and just like continue to live the way you always have out of sheer determination. That is not how it works. So I think a part of me is responding to this like ongoing struggle with Hugh's breathing, because it's just a nice representation of our bodies change. It's not always just about aging, although that can certainly be a factor. And there is something about our desire to see a character frozen in time that I think is very much tied to our own issues with like mortality and the degradation of our bodies, and wanting to be able to exist in a world where that's not a factor at all. And I sympathize, like I really do. I also don't want to be like dealing with aging. I just don't like it. But also, it's a reality. And, you know, it's a reminder also that every one of us who is currently able-bodied, that shit's temporary for every single one of us. There is like, if you are able to live a long life, if you are lucky enough to stay alive, there are going to be shits going wrong in your body eventually. Like it's practically unavoidable. And so I think a lot of us have this like idea of ourselves as being outside of certain things like affecting our lives or happening to us because we weren't born with those problems or they haven't developed for us. And eventually, babes, they're gonna, and you're just gonna have to cope with them. Depending on your personal situation, those things will be wildly different than for somebody else. But like, everybody should be a lot more conscious of the situation that disabled folks face every day and the ways in which their movements are inhibited or their access to things is inhibited, because that's going to be you eventually, and you're just in denial about it. And I hate to do the whole, maybe you should care because that will be you one day, because really we should fucking care because people go through it and it matters. But sometimes the only thing the humans respond to is that it affects you personally. So, you know, there's that. So anyway, Ms. T says, totally agree. I read a wonderful mystery book where the main character had anxiety and chronic pain. It added so much to the story. The title was The Spare Man. Okay, noted, Ms. T. Thank you. So anyway, I didn't mean to spend so much time talking about that, but it just, you know, the fact that he isn't fully back to where they'd been, I just like it. It's not like it never happened, you know? And sure, he has been relieved of the worst of it. So it's not like, you know, it's still the way it was to begin with. It's not like real life for the most part, but it's still helpful to me to know that it wasn't a complete recovery. And he is just feeling like he's gone through weeks of healing. And there's also some limnin magic that he has managed to advance in. And it happens so gradually that he's not sure he's actually seeing progress. He almost is like, am I imagining this? Which I completely understand. I think anybody who does something in which there's gradual improvement has this, whether it be cooking or, for me, weightlifting was one. I would be able to add slightly more weight to things, and I would tell myself I just had a good week. And it wasn't until I was able to keep doing those higher weights for a couple weeks that I started to be like, oh no, I'm just actually getting stronger. And it says, some of it was like his physical training. He, is still running. He is still doing stuff that is actual like body conditioning. But then there is the actual magic. And I thought this was really interesting. He even suspected that Mackerel had gained some aspect of Limnan power, though whether it was at all similar to theirs, he couldn't tell. Some aspect of his bond with the spellbook felt subtly different, though. And I am really compelled by that, wondering if there's anything to do with the fact that his connection with Candoron, later on, he can feel that she's dreaming, which I loved that moment so much, you guys. He doesn't sense that she's awake. There's not this big reunion. It's just him sensing that she's dreaming. And it's evidence that she is still there. She is not dead, but she is still apart from him. So there's like this relief, but also a little bit of regret that he didn't get more of a result, I really liked that being the stage that we're at right now. So let's see. More obviously, Mackerel had started picking up Godric fully armored, often trying to drop him on Sabe. And I was just like, that is quite a load for him to be able to pick up. I mean, my God. There were no questions about how quickly their new affinities were growing. Between the higher risk mana reservoir training they were undergoing and the differential mana reservoir effect, some of their new affinities had already grown more in 2 months than they had in their entire first year of Skyhold, and then some. And that was before even counting in the slow but steady growth of the artificial mana reservoirs in their ether crystal rings. Their siege mana reservoirs had grown the most impressively. Their siege spells paled before those of professional siege mages, but they were already hitting as hard as anything else they had in their arsenals. By Alustin's deadline for his attack on Havoth City, Hugh suspected they'd be the hardest hitting spells they had. And that I'm really interested to see. I always enjoy / get annoyed, but in an admiring way, by the way that John Bierce mentions a thing, but then doesn't really give us details until later. He'll say oh yeah, and they looted stuff from the city and they got some pretty interesting things. And then he just dances off to a totally different topic. And 2 chapters later, you get to find out, just tell me now, John, just tell me now. And Sabe, Sabe had offered them one of the quotes of the trash-living arsonist philosopher Lucan the Sour in the comment of on the speed of their growth. Those who already have great power will always find it easiest to acquire even greater power. No matter how hard one works, life will always reward those who start farther ahead. That is an entire fucking sermon. And it's the most basic shit that people don't want to admit, and it is fucking real. And I love this moment of Hugh realizing that he still sort of thinks of himself as this poor orphan from Emblem, and he's fucking not anymore. He's got power. He's wealthy. And there is something very real about the kind of people who begin to be successful not wanting to cop to the fact that they were born with advantages. There are so many examples of millionaires and billionaires out there. Millionaires. Sorry, I always think of Bernie Sanders every time I start to say this. The millionaires and billionaires. But they all like want to have this fucking fairy tale about how they started at the bottom and they were like working class and eventually got, and it's always bullshit. Like the stories that are real in that direction are one in a million. They become famous stories because they are outliers. And we act like that's just, you know, the way it works. And it's like, no, you only hear about the success stories because the successes are so unheard of that when one happened, but like there's even recently been something circulating. I think it was Posh Spice who's getting like interviewed by somebody for, I don't even know what the interview was about, but she's like in the middle of her sentence trying to tell the interviewer that her family was working class, and David Beckham, her husband, in what I have to say is like one of the most impish throwing under the buses I've ever seen, ducks his head into the room while she's talking and says, "What kind of car did your father drive? What kind of car did your father like drive you to school in?" And she doesn't want to answer. And finally he's like, "No, Aunt, what car?" And she's just like, "A Rolls Royce." And you can see her grimacing. And like what she tried to say initially when she was denying it was like, "Well, sometimes he drove," and I just wanted to laugh because like you're trying to hedge on the question by talking about the other cars your father owned. Like, girl. So anyway, it's the sort of thing exactly. Dan is saying Jeff Bezos buying a house with a garage just to say he started Amazon in a garage always gets me. Yeah, they use these phrases that conveniently leave out the like, you know, $2 million loan from their dad that they got, or the fact that their father was like a manager at a company that did something really similar and talked investors into helping his son. Like that shit is so real. So anyway, I appreciate, like, Hugh did come from the bottom. What has happened to him, he has earned. However, he's also gotten really lucky. You know, let's be honest. There are going to be people in Hugh's position who never stumble across somebody who sees the potential in them. They never even find out maybe that they're a warlock and that's why their powers don't work. Or never wind up being able to pact with somebody of the power level of Candoron. All kinds of things could go differently. So some of it is hard work and some of it is straight up luck. So they are getting ready to depart the village, and there is a celebration thrown to mark their leaving. I love the fact that Sabe gets up there to make a speech about how possums are so crazy and how blessed these people are to live on a possum-free world. I swear. Turns out they've been eating possum, and Godric is just like, "I'm not going to tell her about that, though." And they're in the middle of this, like, you know, packing up and everything in the next morning when somebody pulls them outside and they see the layers of the atmosphere collapsing in on each other. And Talia, I thought, like, you know, she said what I was thinking, because Sabe's like, "We got to get packing now." And Talia is saying we should just wait the storm out. And Hugh is like, Galvacrin says these kinds of storms can last for days and sometimes even weeks. We're already cutting our departure close enough if we want to make my grandmother's conclave in Highvale. It's going to determine the shape of the war. And they begin to, you know, pick up their pace. Poison gases were just the start of the threat. Gusts of wind inside a layer storm were more powerful than any natural wind on Anastas outside a tornado. And if that wasn't bad enough, they were equally likely to give you frostbite or fatal burns. And I was like, that is just really rude. So they have to rush on out of there. And we have a little, like, moment where we are in the heads, or not in the heads, we are hanging out with the Limnans, who our crew has never learned the language, apparently. So they haven't any idea how to speak to the Limnans, and the Limnans evidently do not know their language either. So we get a lot of them talking about like these barbarians and how they don't have proper language or history. And they talk about a philosopher, Aurea the Resistor, and it's like very feeling as if we are just hanging out with our regular crew. These people feel extremely familiar. And I liked this little interlude. I thought it was fun. You think her speech last night was just atavistic nationalism? What? No, that was obviously just a normal, "It's been lovely staying with you. Thanks for hosting us" speech. And I love that. She went up there, did this whole speech. Not a soul understood her, and they let her do it. I like it. Appreciate that. So then we go to chapter 53, and they're working their way through the labyrinth. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's a really interesting thing how different these are, and it must have been so much fun to like brainstorm the way he was going to make each of these labyrinths different from the others. And this maze is made of living wood. Was the labyrinth somehow connected to the sky spear tree it was embedded in? Did they share nutrients with one another somehow? Did the labyrinth help hold the sky spear tree in place? Galvacrin didn't provide answers to any of these questions, at least not in the sections of Galvacrin's Guide to Worlds Hugh had read so far. He suspected it would take him years to read a meaningful chunk of the guide, though, and that was even with the extensive redactions in his copy. There were entire chapters redacted, even segments as long as a normal book. And I've been trying to think of a book that's like approaching that sort of length, and I just think of Wikipedia. Like, it's not a book, it's just, you know, that kind of source of information, especially since he's updating it all the time. But Mackerel, whether this is like a different style labyrinth than what they're used to at all, does not matter, because he can just send them through it. And Hugh is noticing like the grain of the wood twisting a little bit and is sort of thinking, I don't see runes and stuff around, but I wonder if there are sort of spells that are, you know, embedded in the wood itself, which I think is a really fun idea. So they get through the traps and whatnot, and they get to the archway that brings them back over to their own world, which is a mist labyrinth. It's on the other side. So it's this arch, and then you look through it and it's only mist. So they, there's this bit here. Hugh was filled with a dozen conflicting emotions about returning. His friends were all just as bad, and it was only thanks to Mackerel's intervention their distraction didn't lead them off the path and into the mists. If he hadn't intervened, they could easily have ended up stranded in some strange corner of the multiverse, or worse. Hugh did wish Mackerel's intervention had involved less biting, of course, but that seemed a small price to pay. So they come back through to Anastas. They do wind up getting that ether sickness, which does not seem fair considering it's their own world, but also you get jet lag whether you're traveling home or not, you know, so I can see that. And Hugh just has a moment of like, our home is pretty fucking dope too, because they're in this really beautiful spot with a view. And let's see. In the distance, they could make out one of the immense blocky river fortresses rising from the canyon bottom, halfway up to the snow line. The broad, flat roof was covered in bustling activity, though even Hugh's sphinx eyes struggled to make out any details of said activity. And we get some info here about Highvale, and this, I thought, was a really neat idea. One of the things that Highvale does in order to keep themselves from being too vulnerable to a attack from a great power is that they just fucking drain the ether out of the air regularly and keep it at a very low level. So great powers are able to do incredible things, but only when they have enough mana to do it. And if you are able to cut off their supply and all they have to rely on are their own reservoirs and they can't get a hold of ether to convert, that's a wrap. And I just think that's a neat idea. So it says the frequency at which Talia's clan raided Highvale, when most great powers were nervous about the idea, really put Clan Castus' insanity into perspective. And I was like, that is bonkers. Y'all are crazy. Just doing shit to do it. So we have a little bit of a moment here where Hugh thanks Mackerel for getting them through and saving their ass repeatedly, which Mackerel fully deserves. I mean, he has been fucking clutch over and over again. And then we have a bit where Mackerel finally goes and apologizes to Sabe about how it's true that he's maturing and that he shouldn't have treated her the way that he did and yada, yada, yada. And it's like a really sweet, you know, this apology has to be translated through Hugh, of course, but it seemed really sweet to me. And then Sabe says, I've just been messing with you the whole time because you deserve payback after all the pranks you inflict on us. And Mackerel gets so upset and she shoves snow into his pages and then runs off. And I enjoyed this moment a lot. This is when Hugh tests his connection with Canderon and he feels that she is dreaming. And it's just, I really liked this, like I said. So then we go to 54, the Blossom Festival. And what Alustin is doing here, this is interesting. So it says he stood on a twisted plane of glass. If you looked carefully, you could still see the shapes of buildings in the lumpy broken glass. The melting of Helicote by the Havathi great powers hadn't been total. You could even see flickers above the glass, remnants of the Athuema echoes that had made the city unlike any other in history. The glass plane ran for miles in every direction where it came to an abrupt halt against the edges of the Ito forest. He was sure that Tetragnath, I don't remember how they say that, the hive mind of millions of spiders that ruled the woods, was watching him, but Alustin didn't worry over much with that. Tetragnath had kept a peace treaty with the Lord of Bells for centuries, and for whatever inscrutable reasons hadn't maintained his side of the bargain, or had maintained his side of the bargain with the two surviving Helicotans. Which I do wonder about that. Like, a peace treaty, apparently not fighting on their side, but enough to just leave them alone. So he is meeting Valia. This is the thing, you know, in the letter that she had sent talking about, I still think about us at the Blossom Festival. And he takes the hint. It does indeed turn out to be like an invitation, basically. And Alustin is he's like using armor to communicate as if he is standing there with her. But it turns out he's not actually there. He is creating an empty suit of armor because he does not trust to be near her. And she's a little regretful of that. Although, you know, I understand his being cautious. I can't decide if she's the type of person to set up this kind of meet and then, like, you know, attempt to kill him. Part of me feels like she's not the type, but also things have gotten to such a desperate point that I wouldn't blame her too much if she decided to set aside some of the ethics she's been living by up till now. And they kind of start to do their same back and forth with her being like, I still have to try and convince you. I know there's no point. And he says, I was serious about my offer at Dragonclaw Yardang. We could have just left. Which, considering that, you know, in the last chapters, there was a sense of that the two of them had maybe had a romantic thing. You guys remember when he said we should just like leave. I was thinking at the time that it was in a friend's way. And now it seems like maybe that was a sort of like, we could fix what's broken, like the relationship that we used to have, which makes it a lot sadder somehow, that it wasn't just that they were friends. It seems like they had been in love with each other at some point. And there's just a real tragedy to having gone from that kind of relationship to this like very corrupted, weird antagonism that they've got now. So she says something about history and starts to do the whole, Havathi line. And he's like, dude, get out of here with that bullshit. I can't listen to it anymore. History doesn't have like guiding principles and laws. It's just shit that happens. And even if there is a guiding principle, it's a bunch of multiversal fucking assholes going over and doing shit behind the scenes that we don't even know about. It's not about the flows of time and blah. No, it's about beings who want shit doing what they need to get it. And that's it. And she has a whole like, what do you mean? And he really seems to not believe his assertion. He sort of seems to expect that when he says this, she is going to be like, well, I don't want to talk about it. Like basically have an attitude of somebody who has heard this assertion, but is in denial about it. But the reaction she seems to have is more like, what the fuck are you talking about? In a very genuine, this is news to me sense. And he doesn't seem to believe that's real. I do. Just because Valia is such an idealist, I could definitely see her like being somebody that nobody would tell about this shit because they know that she is a person who is by the book and for whom this would not occur to them. Like it would not occur to her that this works this way because she wouldn't work that way, which I can be this way also. I will forget how fucking awful people can be sometimes. And I will think there's only one logical reaction to XYZ because and then I hear about the way some people have taken a thing or the direction they're going with their actions. And I'm just like, what? And she feels like the same type where she's just a little bit blinkered because she's a good person, which is, I don't like the assertion that if you're a good person, you lack imagination. I'm not trying to say that. It's more like if you are a good person, it takes reminding occasionally the lengths people will go to, because you wouldn't. And it just seems like kind of over a line that you think you share that same line with everyone. And everybody's lines fall in a different place. And when she calls them ridiculous claims, he says, take the time to look into them. Don't just like dismiss them. And he pulls a folder out and drops it on the ground, which, at the time she doesn't like open it or touch it, which he understands because his shit's been like traps is his whole deal really. But she does open it up a little bit later. When he asks her about getting promoted, he's like, I really thought after my little trick that I played on you, you'd actually get demoted. This is a weird thing. And she says, they still haven't confirmed a second Duarch after Locke's death. Icola's been using that opportunity to rid the upper ranks of incompetent nobles. They're all furious, but the threat of you is keeping them in line. And Icola's hardly one to punish failures that are out of someone's control. And Alestin is like, you know what? I respect that. It was out of your control. You really did do your best. You've been giving them years of loyal service, and I kind of appreciate that they're rewarding you for that, except for the fact that I have to fucking deal with you again. she asks about what the echo of the Lord of Bells is, and he gives her some bullshit line about it, and also, you know, talks about how there'll be another weapon that he uses that'll, you know, blow through the Havath lines. He's just trying to sow some misinformation here. And then we have an interesting moment of him answering the question that she asked him in the last encounter they had, where he tells her, I didn't make them call me sir. And it's such a, like, I love this reaction, because when he says this, she just looks at him with a confused expression. And this is something that I have experienced myself. I'm sure many people have, where somebody will make a comment that fucking is like, just, it lives in your head for days, and you turn it around from every angle and fucking examine it and overanalyze it and get in your feelings. And then you bring it up finally with the person who said it, and they don't know what you're talking about. Because for them, it was an offhand comment that really didn't mean very much. And to you, it was a defining moment about your personality and an attack, perhaps, you know? And then you realize, like, oh my God, they weren't trying to be making assertions about who I am as a person, or they were, but it simply they didn't see that moment as particularly important. And I really liked it that he brings this up without giving context first, with the seeming expectation that she's going to know what he means right away, and then she doesn't. And her reaction is basically like, I can't believe we've traded barbs so many times. That's the one that landed? And he's like, oh no, they all landed. But this one got to me in particular, because I really did try to be a good teacher and to help them prove everybody who thought they were failures for things that were out of their control wrong. And she's like, yeah, well, then you betrayed them. Which truly, that's what it comes down to, Alustin. Like, I really want to give you credit. I don't entirely withhold all credit, but knowing where it was headed is, you know, man, like, what do you want? You get like a quarter partial credit. Like, that's all you get. So he finally dissolves the armor into loose sheets of paper, and then she picks up the folder and begins reading through it. And it says, the frown on her face growing deeper with every word she read. And I only can imagine that it's information about the, like, multi-dimensional meddling that's been happening. That's what I assume. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. I almost had thought initially, like, maybe it's telling her his real plans. And then I was like, why would he do that? Like, he knows she'll just go to them and tell them immediately. Like, so anyway, that's the end of that little section. And then we go to the multidimensional beings. So we have the liar, who is the woman who was smoking the pipe that Hugh ran into when he was, like, seeing their ether bodies. And it's funny how, like, this woman shows up, and I do find it interesting, but then I literally forget about her entirely. And I feel like she should have been on my mind a little bit more. I don't know why. I just didn't really, like, keep her at the top of the list of priorities. And I just want to know. So we have Tetragnath's millions of spider bodies sitting in a web near the fire. And this might be some information about why Tetragnath is sort of leaving Alustin and Valia alone. Then we have somebody called the Wanderer. Neither of the named needed the campfire, despite the ice and snow on the mountain peak around them. They could have lounged naked atop the peak and still not been at risk from frostbite. There was something comforting about a fire, though, and Tetragnath could probably use the warmth. It had to be a strain for the Endling to control one of his bodies this far from Ito. Have we heard what the Endling is? Like, what that term means? I don't remember if this is something that's been mentioned, but it did not feel familiar to me. And they're thinking maybe Galvacrin will show up, but it turns out that he was worried about cold mines when Imperial Ithos came back and he bailed. And as we know, he was right. It was just a complete accident that shit didn't happen, but he was right to be concerned about it. And the liar says it's about time the Sphinx chose to join our ranks. The Wanderer shook her head. She's not joining us. She only has an Aston magic still. 8 centuries old, and you expect me to believe she never sought power beyond this horrid little world? What is she doing if not becoming named? And that says named with the capital N. The Wanderer chuckled, becoming something else entirely. Something magnificent. And I'm like, say what now? Just some questions I have. Interesting. Oh, right. Thank you, Dan. Dan says the Sun Maw was another one. Endlings are the last of their species. Okay, I remember this now. And MX Shard says, which seems to make them magically resilient and significant. Right. Dan's correcting himself. The Sleeper in the Sands, not the Sun Maws. Right, okay. Then we get a little bit of a moment with the Wanderer's pet bat, Apple Pie. I have a real soft spot, you guys, for pets named after food. I mean, unsurprisingly, since I'm like obsessed with food in general. But there are certain foods that make great names, and apple pie, I like, it really rests on that line where initially I don't like it, and then the more I think about it, the more I am like, no, actually, maybe that's great. You know, I have a friend who had a dog named Pancake, and that just hit. Like, the name Pancake, that's just a good name, you know. My other friend has a cat named Meatball. And, you know, sometimes things just really work. So they see swirls of snow rising in like patterns. And then they pick up a melody. Wasn't expecting the singers to pay this much attention. At most, I'd expected them to have the Tooth Guard hire a land dweller to observe. And I'm just like, this all feels like Mad Libs. I don't know what any of this is. Tetragnath says, I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're referring to. I don't have enough bodies or webs here to get a clear picture of whatever that is. The singers sent a living song to watch, the liar said. Even she seemed a little impressed at that. The Wanderer peered into the ether with her crystal eye at the living song. Opportunities to study the magical constructs were rare indeed, but she couldn't make much sense of it. Its ether body was far more complex than any elemental. She was careful not to look at the ether body of the liar, though. No need to make that mistake again. Which could mean a lot of things. It could mean, like, looking at the ether body was somehow painful because it's more than she can comprehend. It could mean that the liar was just like, the fuck are you doing? And belted her across the face. Like, who knows? Or it could be like, it was, I'm thinking about, like, in the Dresden Files, sometimes doing what he calls a soul gaze, where you make eye contact for a prolonged moment with somebody, can pull you into their soul for a moment so that you see who they really are. And sometimes it is not awesome and can be really disturbing. Maybe something like that. But Anyway, it turns out there had been that Hydra that, like, with the chains, and Raymond the Chained, who had been here right before them and fled north for whatever reason, much faster than a Hydra should be able to move. So they sit and watch this song, and it says, they were Kandaron's friends and allies, or as close as old monsters like them could have friends. Then, as if out of nowhere, a Kyrene appeared on another mountain. It wasn't particularly large as Kyrene went, only 60 or 70 feet tall, but it was completely invisible to the naked eye. It showed up clearly enough inside the ether to the Wanderer's crystal eye, though. What's a Kyrene watcher doing here, or is that a chronicler? Neither. That's a Kyrene birth witness. Fitting, Tetragnath observed. The conversation ended there because the process they'd all come to watch had begun. Deep beneath the earth, far past the 3 immense ward tunnels circling Skyhold, was a 4th tunnel. A ring 12 leagues in diameter, buried so deep within the bedrock that no mere stone mage could ever hope to detect it with their senses. There were no paths leading down to the tunnel, nor any access points. Kandaron had spent decades constructing the ring tunnel at the absolute farthest reaches of her magic. As if that weren't enough, the Sphinx had wrapped the entire tunnel in a pocket dimension of its own, one that protected it from geological forces and from any magical detection. Not even the liar, with all her powers, suspected its presence. There had long been rumors of its existence in Skyhold, but there were so many rumors about secret places in Skyhold that Galvacrin would have trouble keeping track of them all. The Kyrene birth witness sensed it, but it had no reason to share. The tunnel's secrecy, of course, was for the best. If any of the hordes even suspected the existence of the tunnel, they would have invaded Anastas in a heartbeat. For all the tunnel's importance, it had finished its work decades ago. It had funneled immense torrents of energy in great loops until they hammered into one another, channeled them through enchantments, wards, chained elementals, and magics even more esoteric. It would most likely never run again. It didn't need to, though, because high above it, where the gathered multiversal powers watched, the fruits of its labor were ripening. Atop Skyhold, in the impossible depths of a blue crystal orb, light began to shine. And that is the end of that chapter. Now, it's the end of the book. There is a chapter afterwards, from the perspective of one of Talia's brothers. I didn't read this, you guys, in the way that the audiobook was set up. It felt like a separate thing, and I didn't really want to take time up with it because so much happened towards the end of this. So I really would rather talk about that separately if Dan wants me to talk about it at all, but I don't even know if you do. This might be something that's just sort of, a fun little thing, but not actually of importance to the main story or crucial to my enjoyment of things. So, okay, it's a separate short story, they're all saying. I didn't read it. If you want me to read it, I definitely will. I'll probably listen to on the audiobook anyway, but just in terms of coverage, just let me know how you want me to handle that. But yeah, so it sounds like, oh, interesting. Dan is saying in the chat that this tunnel sounds like a particle accelerator. And I really like that comparison. What I was thinking of was, what's the word I want? A distillery. Well, you've got something that's sending things through this particular process until it gets more and more concentrated is what I'm imagining. Because I'm thinking of the ways that you can add flavors and the filtration processes and everything so that you put something in that's very benign, some mashed, potatoes and water, and then you wind up on the other end with fucking vodka, and it sort of feels like magic. So, yeah, this feels like the contingency plan that Canderon had set up to ensure that she didn't die. And I am really interested in how this works, how she got it set up. They are all talking about how she only has Anastan magic. And one, I'm curious how they know that for a fact. I don't know if they could be wrong, but it seems like they have ways of perceiving. I'm going to assume that if she had more than Anastan magic, there'd be some way for them to tell that she wouldn't be able to hide. So I'll take their word on it. The fact that it's mentioned that the liar can't detect the ring below her, it almost feels like they are here to watch this process, but it was only described to them that it would happen and not described how it was going to be done. And so they arrived in order to the fact that there is a Kyrene birth witness here. I don't know what the exact job is, but I'm assuming the birth is going to be Canderon's birth. And also the fact that they start talking about this visual, what do you call it? This visual song. I'm trying to find this little description here. But who is it that it says we weren't expecting the singers to pay this much attention, and singers is capitalized. I don't know. Again, have the singers been mentioned? Because they're described, the way they're talked about here feels like they're talking about a group of spirits or something that's sort of observing in the moment. What I keep thinking of, to be honest, is something that's sort of fae-like. And I have no idea if that's anything. But the fact that they sent a living song to watch feels like they are honoring what's going on here somehow. I don't know. I just want to know a little bit more about that as well and how that works. Dan says, I think this was meant to be confusing. We weren't meant to understand. Just realize that whatever is happening is noteworthy in the greater multiverse. Yes, agree. I get that. So yeah, I'm really interested because it seems like, and the timing may not actually line up. I'm assuming this is happening in terms of the actual, what's chronological order, that it's happening the way it's written, so that Hugh and his friends have gotten back and then this begins. So if that's true, and Hugh is in Anastas by the time this whole process starts, I have to assume if Canderon is being reborn, like I suspect, he will be able to tell that's what's going on through the bond. And because he says something about how their bond feels a little bit different than it did. Now, it could simply be because of the fact that Canderon is dreaming and he's able to tell that. But it could also be because Canderon was her energy was beginning to shift due to whatever this backup plan is. But yeah, so that's the end of the book. And I gotta tell you guys, I knew this was going to be the last section last week, but it still feels like it kind of crept up on me. And I am really stepping back from everything, kind of shocked that there's only one book left. It feels like there's enough for a few more. And I'm wondering if John Bierce is going to write anything else in this universe with different characters, because it feels like a very well realized universe he could also write from one of the other universes our friends visited. You know, he could do that, or he could just do a whole new thing. But I have an interest, like the concept of a lot of writers doing, I'm going to say this in a way that sounds like I'm giving him credit. I don't want to say it that way, but I can't think of a better way to word it. But doing the thing that Brandon Sanderson does, where he creates like a solar system, basically, and then tells stories from within that solar system. I'm not trying to say Brandon Sanderson is the first to come up with this concept or the only writer to ever do this and that everybody else is just copying him. But he's the first writer that I became aware of doing it. And I know that Will White also does this. So I'm sort of wondering if John Bierce is going to follow that same pattern or not. Doesn't matter. I'm just wondering. So, all right. Well, that is it, kiddos. So I'm really excited because next I'm going to be starting the final book, and I really want to know what the fucking like last spell is. What is it? The Lord of Bells is the name of the book, but it's the last echo of the Lord of Bells is the name of the spell. And I am really, when Alustin says to Valia, she's like, well, what is it? And he says it's nothing special, but it says then he lied. And I'm like, what is it? What is it? I want to know. Dan says it's done in comic books a lot, but Sanderson has done it really explicitly in fantasy novels. And that's pretty new. Okay, cool. Yeah, I understand like setting things up that way because you make things feel connected and you could make them actually be connected if you're inclined as a writer, but you can also create a great variety in like magical systems or even something as simple as like the terrain and climate within a story if that's important, which it really is in some of Brandon Sanderson's work. So yeah. All right. Well, guys, thanks so much for hanging out with me. I'm really excited to start the next book, so I'll see you all on Thursday for that. And thank you, Dan, for commissioning this. Appreciate it a lot. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.